Chapter 10. The Warrior's Visit. Reaching Denver in the early summer, Bill and his companions found it a wild and crowded city. Nearby Cherry Creek had given up its gold to the early comers. The others were forced to look in more distant places. Like most of the fortune seekers, Bill and his pals knew nothing about gold mining. Moving on to Golden and Black Hawk, they panned the gravel that others had probably worked before them. In 2 months, they were broke. Hundreds of miners were in the same pinch. The golden bubble had burst, and there was nothing to do but return home. Bill traded the wagon and mules for food to give him and his friends supplies for the journey. In no mood to walk the 700 miles, Bill thought of another means. Why not build a raft and float down the Platte and Missouri rivers all the way to Fort Leavenworth? His companions welcomed the plan, and after lashing several logs together, the three set out. All went well until they were within a mile of Julesburg, Colorado. There, the swift current wrecked the raft, dumping riders, gear, and food into the stream. Bill and his companions swam to safety, saving only the clothes they wore. At Julesburg, Bill went to the Russell, Majors, and Waddell freight corrals and found a friend, George Chrisman, in charge of the station. He had no trouble winning Chrisman's consent to let him and his pals ride back to Leavenworth with an empty wagon train. Although he said little about it, Bill smarted over his failure as a gold hunter. For a year, he had given little to his family's support. He wanted to earn money quickly if possible to make up for this lack. His thoughts turned again and again to the bales of fur he had seen at Fort Leavenworth, or Laramie. Furs were valuable and could be turned into money quickly. Despite his first lack of success at it, he believed trapping offered the best hope of earning a year's wages in a few months. Bill decided David Harrington, a friend a few years older than he, could be interested in making a fur hunt. Dave did not disappoint him. They agreed to work the creeks leading into the Republican River of western Kansas. Loading a wagon with traps, food, tools, and ammunition, they set out in the late fall of 1859. At Mrs. Cody's suggestion, Bill added to his schoolbooks to the camp gear. There would be long winter evenings when he could work at his reading. Using the skill learned from Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, and other mountain men, Bill scouted the streams until he found a region swarming with beaver and game. It was deep in the wilderness, 125 miles from the closest settler. Although they had sighted no Indians, Bill and Dave were always on the alert. A room-sized hollow in the creek bank became the young trappers' winter camp. They put up a log wall across the front, made a stone fireplace beside the doorway, and laid poles on the floor to keep it dry. After building bunks and closing the wall chinks with mud, they had a snug hut. Their two oxen were allowed to graze during the day, but at night they were penned in a pole corral near the dugout. In the first few weeks, Bill and Dave had to work into the night to skin the beaver they trapped. To his delight, Bill watched the pile of furs grow. The winter's catch would exceed his best hopes, he saw. The two trappers were startled one night to hear the oxen bellow and race around the corral. Grabbing rifles, Bill and Dave dashed from the cabin. A dark form reared before them as they reached the pen. With an angry roar, the animal lunged at Dave. Bill raised his rifle and fired into the monster's gaping mouth. The beast fell dead in front of Dave, and only then did Bill see that it was a large black bear. "Wow," Dave gasped. "That was a close one for me." Bill, I was too scared to," and then he cut off his sentence. Bill hurried past the slain animal to examine one of the oxen stretched out on the corral floor. The other one paced about nervously. "Dave, get a lantern quick," Bill said. "I'm afraid one of our steers has been crippled." When Dave had returned with the light, Bill saw that the bear had clawed the ox so badly it had to be killed. Although this act raised a serious problem, how to move the wagon with its furs in the spring, there was no answer for it at the particular moment. "We'll have to get another ox later," Bill said. "We'll think of a way when the time comes." Not long after the bear's raid, the trappers were hunting elk near their camp when Bill slipped and broke his leg just above the ankle. Helped by Dave, he hobbled back to the dugout and fell groaning upon his bunk. As best he could, Dave fastened splints over the breaks and tried to ease his companion's pain. "Now we are in for it, Dave," Bill sighed. "I'm as helpless as a papoose." "Well, there's only one thing for me to do," Dave said. "Go after a team of oxen so that I can haul you back home. I'll ride on the steer that we still have here." "It's a long trip to the nearest settler," said Bill. "More than 100 miles. "I hate to leave you here alone, Bill, but there's no other way. I should be back in about 20 days. I'll take enough furs to pay for what we need." Dave brought in a large heap of wood, filled buckets and pans with water, and cooked up a supply of food. Then he made a pair of crude crutches for Bill. "By the time you run low on food, you'll be able to hobble around and cook more," Dave said. Bill hated to see his companion go, but made no protest. He tried to be cheerful when Dave left, but it was a weak effort. Unused to idleness and being alone, Bill found the days endless. He read his books, slept as much as he could, and practiced walking on his crutches. He kept track of time by notching a stick to mark each dreary, dragging day. By the end of 2 weeks, he was able to move about the cabin fairly well. He tried to picture Dave bursting into the cabin, and yet he knew another week must pass before that was even possible. Bill had fallen asleep over a book when he was startled by a hand on his shoulder. He looked up into the painted face of a Sioux Indian. Hiding his fright, he said, "How?" He noticed 6 other warriors had crowded into the dugout and heard more outside. To his vast relief, he recognized the leader as Rain-in-the-Face, a chieftain he had met at Fort Laramie, and quickly he reminded the Indian of their friendship. "Why you here?" Rain-in-the-Face asked. Bill pointed to his bandaged leg and explained how he had broken it. While he talked, the braves pressed about him with raised knives and tomahawks. Their leaders held them back. "Braves hunt scalps," said Rain-in-the-Face. He paused to let Bill think about that. Finally he added, "Paleface, my friend. No take him scalp. Need food." Again the chieftain had to order the braves away from Bill. They obeyed by grumbling angrily. Bill's supply of food caught their attention, and they grunted happily as they set about cooking a feast for themselves. Their meal finished, the warriors gathered up Bill's rifles, revolver, and ammunition. The young trapper's heart sank as his unwelcome guests bundled up the remaining sugar, coffee, flour, and salt. He almost cried out in protest, but he held his tongue. At the last moment, Rain-in-the-Face left a small amount of flour and meat with Bill. It was enough to last him a week if he stretched it to the limit. Although glad to see the last of the Indians, Bill had another worry to plague him. Suppose they met Dave. Perhaps Dave would never reach him now. Then what would happen to him? And a few days after the Indians' visit, a blizzard struck the Republican River Valley. The wind howled hour after hour, piling snow around the dugout. Where was Dave, Bill wondered. Had he become lost in the storm? Perhaps he couldn't find the cabin. He might have frozen to death. And as the days passed with maddening slowness, and Dave was still absent, the strain was almost more than Bill could bear. He could not read or sleep. His taste for food left him. Only a few sticks of firewood remained. He counted the notches that marked the passing of time. 27 days. One more, and Dave would have been gone 4 weeks. Somehow, Bill worried through another night. And the next day began the same as the others. He went to the door time after time to gaze out upon the white desert unbroken by a single trail. At last he threw himself upon his bunk and fell asleep out of sheer weakness. He awoke suddenly as though alarmed by a bad dream. Every sense was alert. What was that? A cry? A shout? Faintly it came again. "Bill! Oh, Bill!" He jumped up so quickly he sent his crutches flying. Crawling across the floor for them, he fairly bounded to the door and pulled it open. No one was in sight. The sun shining upon the snow dazzled him. Maybe he was losing his mind and was imagining things, Bill told himself. Then the cry came again. "I'm coming, Bill." Dave? Bill's mouth went dry, and he couldn't utter another sound, nor could he see Dave urging a team of oxen toward the dugout. Each animal carried a pack of supplies. In a short time, Dave was inside the cabin with Bill. Their greeting filled the room with a happy din, and many minutes passed before they could control their joy even to start a meal. They talked for hours about the trials they had faced and overcome. Dave explained that he had reached the settlers without trouble and started back with a new team of oxen. Then the blizzard had overtaken him, and he found shelter in a canyon where he was forced to remain 2 days. After that, the deep snow had slowed his travel. As soon as Dave could load the wagon with their furs, traps, and camp gear, the trappers started for home. To his disgust, Bill was forced to ride during the whole journey because of his injury. They reached Fort Leavenworth in March of 1860, sold their pelts for a high price, and divided the profits. Despite his accident, Bill had a good sum to turn over to his mother. At Leavenworth, Bill heard news of a daring project planned by Russell, Majors, and Waddell that made him forget about fur trapping and wagon trains. The freight company, in answer to demands of California miners and settlers, was about to start a fast mail and express service across the West. Mounted on swift horses, relays of riders would race 2,000 miles between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento in 10 days, 15 days faster than the stagecoaches. The new mail line would be known as the Pony Express. Here was something made to order for Bill Cody's love of excitement and adventure. Along the dangerous plains and mountain trail, the riders would have to deal alone with Indians, outlaws, storm, snow, and flooded rivers. For risking their lives in this manner, they would be paid $125 a month. The best Bill could hope for as a bullwhacker was $40. The high pay of the Pony Express became his goal, but his broken leg was still far from healed. He spent the weeks after his return home building his strength to become an expressman. When he could again ride with his usual dash and daring, he set out to ask for the job. Chapter 11. Pony Express Rider. George Chrisman looked at Bill Cody again, his eyes sweeping the tall, wiry body clad in fringed buckskin. Then his eyes met the piercing stare that pleaded with him silently. "Sure, Bill, you look older than your 14 years, Chrisman said at last, but that doesn't make you old enough. You're hiring young riders for the Express, Bill pointed out. I don't see why you can't take me. Now, if you were about 18 or 20 even, our boys have to be real lightweights." Bill replied, I don't weigh more than 120. I'm a good rider, George, and I know how to handle a gun, any kind of gun. Chrisman nodded. "Sure, Bill, that you do. But the trail out here is really rugged. I'm not saying you couldn't handle it." The boss of the Julesburg division of the Express thought for a minute. "Why don't you see Bill Trotter? He's bossing a stretch at the eastern end of the line. You're more apt to get a job from Bill, and it wouldn't hurt to ask." Bill saw that it was useless to argue longer with George. He wanted a job carrying the Express, and even if it had to be across a stretch of plain as safe and easy as a rocking chair, he'd take it. But later, he had asked to be sent farther west, where he could expect a little excitement. Even Bill Trotter wasn't too eager to make a place for Bill Cody. He finally agreed to give him a month's trial, and Bill became the youngest of the 80 riders who sped with the mail to California and back. The 2,000-mile trail had been divided into sections, 45 to 85 miles long, over which a rider raced. Relay stations where fresh mounts were held for the riders were set up about 15 miles apart. Station keepers lived at the relay points to care for the 400 ponies needed for the service. And on the longer runs, the riders changed horses half a dozen times. These mounts were California Mustangs, tough and swift animals that could outrun the fastest Indian ponies. The riders were armed with revolvers and hunting knives, but were ordered not to stop and fight unless cornered. They were to depend upon the speed of their mounts to carry them out of trouble. At the starting points, St. Joseph and Sacramento, the mail was locked into 4 pouches set into the corners of a leather apron called a mochila. This leather square fitted over the small saddle so that the rider sat upon it when mounted. At each relay point, the mochila was quickly stripped from the horse and slapped upon the back of the waiting mount. 2 minutes were allowed a rider for this exchange, but some were able to make the swing in 30 seconds. Because speed was all important, the rider's load of mail weighed 20 pounds or less. Letters were usually written on tissue paper, since the express charges were $5 for a half an ounce. The mail was wrapped in oiled silk before being placed in the pouches to keep dry. Started on April 3, 1860, the Pony Express was an immediate success. Riding day and night, the carriers passed along their mochilas without delay, the last rider delivering the mail 10 days after it had started its long journey. The fast time surprised and thrilled the nation. The express riders became new heroes of the struggle to conquer the West. Bill Cody took little pride in his part, although he never failed to finish his run on time. The only breaks in his unexciting 3-hour ride came at 3 relay stations on his route. He longed for a time when he could ride for George Chrisman or Alf Slade, out where Indians and outlaws offered a challenge. His month's trial went on for another 30 days. Then he received a message that ended it for a time. His mother, never strong, had become ill again, and Bill was needed at home. Grudgingly, he turned in his saddle and mochila to help run Mrs. Cody's hotel. Bill had hardly returned home before Paiute Indians started a war in Nevada that shut down the Pony Express for nearly 6 weeks. Attacking relay points in the mountains and across the desert, they killed station keepers, burned the buildings, and ran off valuable express ponies. Troops had to move into the far west to put down the uprising. Although Russell, Majors, and Waddell suffered losses of $75,000 in the raids, they rebuilt the stations, bought more ponies, and hired new station men. By midsummer, the express riders were again pounding over the trail. Mrs. Cody's health improved during each week Bill was home. When he saw that he could be spared, Bill hired a man to help his mother and rode to Fort Leavenworth to call on Alec Majors. "I'm ready to ride again, or to ride the express again, Uncle Alex, but this time I want to go farther west." Mr. Majors nodded. "We're having a hard time keeping good riders beyond Laramie, Bill. Indians and road agents are too much for some of the boys, and they're quitting. I'll give you a letter to Elf Slade out at the Horseshoe Station." "Thank you, Uncle Alex. I'm ready to go." And Bill worked his way to Fort Laramie as a bullwhacker with one of the Lou Simpson's freight trains, and then rode to where Elf Slade, a tough but trusted division boss, had his quarters. At first Slade brushed Bill aside with the remark, "I don't hire kids for my run. Go away, you bother me." "But Mr. Slade, I rode for Bill Trotter, and Mr. Majors thinks I'll do. He says so in this letter." "So you rode for Bill Trotter," Slade said in surprise. "Well now, that's different. All right, I'll give you a chance because I can sure use some boys with guts. If you can carry the mail on my division, you can go anywhere." Bill quickly learned that he had taken on a man-sized chore. His 76-mile run from Red Buttes on the North Platte to 3 crossings on the Sweetwater River cut through a rough countryside. He changed horses 5 times, but even so, they ended their relays worn out. At the western end of his run, he rode up a canyon through which the river boiled from wall to wall. In a distance a few rods, he splashed across the stream 3 times. Indians or outlaws were likely to lurk in any one of a dozen places. A short time after starting to work for Slade, Bill had the taste of what to expect. Upon finishing his run to 3 crossings, he was told by the station keeper that the rider supposed to relieve him had been killed in a fight the night before. "You'll have to carry through to Rocky Ridge, Bill," the keeper said. "There's no other rider here to go." "How far is Rocky Ridge?" Bill asked. 85 miles. Bill bit his lip. He thought the hot meal and rest his body craved. Then he remembered Elf Slade's challenge and said, "All right, get me some bread and meat so I can eat while I ride. Let's not waste any time." And 6 hours later, Bill rode into the Rocky Ridge station. He had barely reached it before the rider from the west galloped in. Although stiff and sore, Bill swung the mailbags upon his saddle, mounted, and started for the east, over the long trail he had just covered. On and on he rode through 3 crossings to his home station at Red Buttes. Nearly dead from weariness, he delivered the mail on time, having traveled 322 miles in 21 hours. He tired out 20 horses on his run, one of the longest in the history of the Pony Express. Jack Keatley, another express rider, once rode more than 300 miles without rest, having covered the last part of his run asleep in the saddle. Pony Bob Haslam chalked up the record of 380 miles as an express carrier. He had 11 hours rest between the start and finish, however. In 1861, the bitterness between North and South over slavery broke into civil war. The Pony Express riders sped the news to California, but to them, and to 15-year-old Bill Cody, the war was distant and unreal. The people of the West had their own troubles to worry over. With the Army giving most of its attention to the fighting in the South, the Western bullwhackers, stagecoach drivers, and Pony Expressmen were left largely to their own efforts to meet attacks of hostile Indians. The Indians became especially troublesome along the Sweetwater that year, and Bill saw more than enough of them. Although alert for any hint of danger, he was ambushed one day by 15 braves when 8 miles from Horse Creek. Pressing himself flat upon the pony's back, he outsped the pack. Arriving at the station, he was dismayed to find that the warriors had paid an earlier call. They had killed the stock tender, burned the buildings, and stolen the spare horses. Bill was forced to ride his fagged-out mount another 12 miles to Plout's station before getting a fresh pony. And not long after this scare, Bill received a station keeper's warning of many Indian signs on the trail ahead. The express route lay through a wild section marked by a deep valley that narrowed sharply at its outlet. About halfway through the valley, a boulder stood in the open. Although feeling sure that he would meet the warriors there if anywhere, Bill galloped into the valley. A high cliff stood on one side, and timber covered a steep slope on the other. From a distance he saw a spot of color beside a huge rock. It disappeared at once, and before he could be sure, it was a feather from a brave's headdress. Riding on boldly, Bill kept to the trail until within gun range of the boulder. Swerving sharply, he swung himself to the pony's side and angled away from the rock just as a rifle shot sounded from behind it. The bullet whistled over Bill's back. As though the shot were a signal, a score of mounted Indians broke from the timber and sped to cut off Bill. Spurring his horse, Bill raced to beat them to the narrow end of the valley. Drawing his revolver, he glanced across the whooping warriors. Their chieftain rode a swift pony and was soon ahead of the pack, and Bill saw that the leader was the one he must fear the most. Their mounts pounding along at top speed, Bill and the chieftain drew toward the valley's narrow pass, and when only 30 yards apart, the riders raised their weapons, the Indian stretching his bow, Bill leveling his revolver, each aiming with deadly intent. Arrow and bullet darted at their targets. Bill saw the chieftain flinch as the lead caught him, and with a cry of pain he toppled from his mount. A chorus of angry shouts, followed by a rain of arrows, reached out after Bill, and a moment later the young express rider dashed into the choked pass and galloped out of the valley. The braves chased him to within sight of the next relay station, but by then he was far in the lead, and when he dismounted he found an arrow sticking into the horse's flank. Wagon trains and stagecoaches were only a little more safe than the express riders from an Indian attack. So many horses were run off from relay stations that the riders and drivers were having trouble moving mail and passengers. Then a war party attacked a stagecoach between Split Rock and Three Crossings and killed the driver and 2 passengers. A group of outraged trail workers met at Red Buttes to plan a way to punish the Indians. When a tall, bronzed man whose hair hung to his shoulder spoke to the crowd, all listened with respect. He was looked upon as the leader. Although it was the first time he had seen the man, Bill Cody did not have to be told that this was James Butler Hickok, known to his friends as Wild Bill Hickok. Then a stagecoach driver, had already proved himself as one of the West's fastest men on the draw. Bill could not take his eyes off Wild Bill. His quiet manners, his soft voice, the long hair, and 2 pearl-handled revolvers at his side made a deep impression. Bill was surprised to find that Hickok was only 24, barely 9 years older than himself, and he promised himself that someday he would pattern his looks after his new hero. "We want about 40 men for this job," Bill heard Hickok say. "I'll take some hard riding and maybe a bit of powder burning. We'll teach the redskins a lesson if we get a chance, but most of all, we want to get back those horses. Now how many of you think you're cut out for it?" A score spoke up quickly, and then others volunteered. Bill moved up and said, "Mr. Hickok, I'd like to go with you." Wild Bill looked at the young express carrier sternly. He measured him for a minute before saying, "You're Bill Cody, aren't you?" Surprised that the man knew him, Bill stammered a reply. "You'll do, Bill," Hickok said. "I've heard about your work with Lou Simpson and your riding with the express. You're the kind of fellow I want." The party was soon made up of preparations finished for the start. Early the next morning, the 40 horsemen set out towards the Powder River. Chapter 12. Bill Fights Outlaws. Although the youngest among the 40 men starting the Indian hunt, Bill Cody was the most carefree. After the hard riding required of an expressman, this jaunt was a vacation. He enjoyed the company of old and new friends, but most of all he was excited by this chance to ride with Wild Bill Hickok. Whenever he could, he pushed himself to the leader's side. In the next few days, the Indian trail led north from Platte, then west toward the Bighorn Mountains to the Crazy Woman Fork. Here it became clear that other bands of warriors had joined the first, bringing more stolen horses. Wild Bill halted to confer with his riders. "We're getting close to the main bunch," he said, "and from now on we have to look alive. While I ride ahead to scout the trail, the rest of you take it easy. Keep off the ridges." More cautiously, the men moved behind Wild Bill towards Clear Creek, another branch of the Powder River. Bill Cody felt the tension among his companions. They were now deep in Sioux country, where whites rarely ventured without army escort. Presently, Wild Bill galloped back to halt his men. "There's a big camp with a lot of hosses on the far side of the creek, 3 miles yonder," he said. "There's too many redskins for us to handle in a stand-up fight. We'll lay low back here until dark and then make a surprise visit. Our only chance is to stampede the stock." Several hours of daylight remained before the group could attack. Hickok forbade the lighting of campfires, and most of the men napped until dark. Bill Cody was too excited to think of sleep. Night settled upon the hills at last, and the leader gave the word to advance. Bill rode near the head of the group, eager to be among the first to fall upon the warriors. He had some scores to settle with them. The whites approached the creek unnoticed, and at a signal from Hickok, the riders charged upon the camp, shouting wildly and firing rifles and revolvers. The surprise attack stunned the Indians. They dashed about in confusion as the horsemen swept over them, and from the camp the raiders sped to the nearby flat where scores of horses grazed. The entire herd broke before the surge of horsemen, and in a moment was in a wild stampede. Turning the mounts across the creek, the whites headed them south, driving them for several miles before halting to rest. They had not only recovered all of their stolen horses, but had taken at least 100 Indian ponies. Elated by their success, half the riders turned back to complete their route of the warriors. Without mounts, the Indians were forced to scatter into the hills to save their lives. 4 days later, the Hickok party reached the Sweetwater station with their horses. The stagecoaches rolled again, and Bill Cody returned to his express run, free for a time from attack. But the trail was never without its danger for the riders. More and more often, large sums of money were being sent by express, and outlaws made several attempts to hold up and rob the carriers. One day, Al Slade came to Bill with a report that he would have to carry several $1,000s on his next trip. "I know, Mr. Slade," Bill said. "I was told about it at Red Buttes. I guess everybody along the line knows it now." "You can figure that the road agents heard about it too," Slade said. "They may make a play for it on our division. There are plenty of spots where they can ambush a rider." Bill became thoughtful, and at last he said, "I think I can outsmart them, Mr. Slade. I have an idea." Slade said, "I hope it's a good one." Bill had time enough to work out his scheme before the rider from the east reached him. Taking a spare Makela, he stuffed the front pouches with paper to make them appear filled with money. Then he folded a blanket to fit snugly under his saddle. He was ready when the rider was to relieve dashed into the station. Hurriedly stripping the mail pouches and from the sweating horse, Bill placed them upon his own mount. Over them he spread the blanket so that it hid his Makela with the banknotes. Next, he cinched his saddle in place, and upon it that fitted the pouches stuffed with paper. A moment later he was off, galloping into the hills to the west, and even though looking for a gunman in every clump of trees or rock-strewn gully along the trail, he was startled when a bearded outlaw stepped into the path from a thicket in a narrow ravine. At once another road agent sprang up a few yards behind the first. Both leveled their rifles at the rider, and Bill skidded his horse to a stop. "Hands up, boy," the first robber called. "Give us the money. Hand it over peaceful-like, and you won't get hurt." "You're stopping the government mail," Bill said, trying to hold his voice steady. "Let me by, if you know what's good for you." "All we want is the money, boy," the outlaw said, his voice hardened. "Give it to us pronto, or this will be your last ride. We're not fooling around with you. You'll hang for this." The first outlaw aimed his rifle at Bill's head. "Are you tossing the money bags to me, or do I have to?" Bill took courage in a show of anger. "Well, all right, but you'll hang." He tugged at the Makela under his arm and pulled it free. "Here, take it," he said, and flung it into the nearest robber's head. The man ducked and turned to pick up the bags. Bill dropped his hands to his holster, jerked out the revolver, and fired at the second robber, striking him in the arm. At the same moment, Bill spurred his horse into a sudden leap. Its forelegs struck the man still crouched over and fumbling for the mailbags. Sent sprawling, the robber lost hold of his rifle, and before he could recover it, Bill was galloping up the trail, the money safe under him. A rifle shot sounded behind him, and a bullet whined past his shoulder. Bill pressed himself to the horse's back and sped out of the range of the outlaw's fire. He finished his run unharmed and passed his mail pouches intact. Unaware of it himself, Bill began to show by the spring of 1861 the strain of the long, hard hours in the saddle. He lost weight, and he slept poorly. The change in this daring young rider did not escape Al Slade. "I'm taking you off the run for a spell, Bill," the division boss said. "You're worn out, and you need a rest." "I'm all right, Mr. Slade," Bill protested. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do, Bill," Slade said firmly. "I want you to help look after stock at the station and be handy when I need a relief rider. But for a few days, just take it easy. Do a little hunting, some fishing." As he thought about it, Bill realized that his early zest for carrying the mail had weakened. He was not alone in that feeling. Few riders could endure the long hours of pounding over the trail, and changes among them were frequent. Bill enjoyed to the utmost his free time to roam over the hills and canyons around his express station. When he did relieve a rider now and then, it was a welcome break in his idleness. Promising to bring in some fresh game for supper, Bill started his hunt one day on a scrawny horse owned by the station keeper. On the lookout for sage hens, he rode further than he intended to, but finally shot a pair. As he turned toward home late in the day, he entered a wooded ravine in which he noted many hoof marks. Puzzling over this evidence of horses in that remote region, he rode on until 8 riders rounded a bend in the trail. They were upon him before he could even think of hiding. From their hard looks and fierce appearance, Bill knew at once that this was an outlaw band, either road agents or horse thieves. With a start, he recognized 2 of them as former teamsters with one of Lou Simpson's wagon trains. "Howdy, gents," he said. What are you doing around here, punk?" the leader growled. "Hunting." Bill held up his 2 sage hens. "I'm heading for the horseshoe station. Got anything against that?" One of Simpson's former bullwhackers spoke up. "That's Bill Cody, boss. He carries mail for Slade." "One of El Slade's boys, eh?" the leader said. "I guess we'd better—" And then he turned to Bill. "Come along to camp with us, Cody. Maybe you'd like to have a bite with us." Bill felt the evil intent behind the invitation, and he knew better than to resist. "Sure, boss," he said. "Glad to." Bill waited until the horsemen started up before turning his mount to join them. One hung back, however, and said, "Move ahead, Cody. I'll stay back here so you won't get lost." He laughed at his clever joke. Riding at an easy lop, the group did not slow down until it swung into the canyon thick with brush and saplings. Bill thought, "I have to do something before we get to their hideout." He noted that the riders were now strung out in single file, the leader 50 yards ahead of him, and darkness was setting. The gloom was already thick in the canyon. Bill let one of the sage hens slip from his fingers. "Oops," he exclaimed, stopping his horse. He glanced at the rider behind him. "Will you pick up that hen for me?" "Clumsy ox," the horseman muttered, but he stepped down and leaned over to reach the hen. Bill was upon him instantly, cracking him across the skull with his revolver butt. With a groan, the man hit the ground. The sound of the blow carried to the rider in front of Bill. His hands was upon his 6-shooters when Bill swung about him to face him. Before he could raise it, Bill fired, and the man fell from his saddle. Spurring his horse, Bill raced down the trail. The curses and the beat of hoofs told him that the others were following. Crouching low, he urged his mount to speed up. It was useless, Bill realized then. The plug road was no express pony, and no match either for the pursuing horsemen. Rounding a bend in the trail, Bill leaped from his mount, giving him a hearty slap as he did so. Throwing himself into a clump of brush, he hid until 6 outlaws thundered past after the riderless horse. Scrambling up the ravine's steep slope, Bill climbed until he was breathless. No horse could follow him there, he was sure, but he must have the ridge between him and the gang before he could feel safe. At daylight, he stumbled, footsore, hungry, and scratched into the horseshoe station. Another rider carried word to Slade of Bill's brush with the outlaws. The division boss rounded up 20 men to ride against the outlaw band. With Bill guiding them, they found the hideout, but it was deserted and the thieves had escaped. As had happened before, a letter from home called Bill back to Kansas. Mrs. Cody was again seriously ill and wanted her son near. It was not a matter of money now. Bill had been earning good wages, most of which he sent his mother. He was torn between her appeal and his loyalty to the Pony Express. When Bill showed the letter to Elf Slade, the division boss urged him to go at once. "You've been a good man, Bill, but it's only a question of time before the Express would be too much for you. A fellow can take just so much of it." Bill rode to Fort Laramie, and from there worked his way home with a wagon train. He found conditions far different from the way he had left them.